Welcome to the Gay Buddhist Forum, where teachers from all schools of Buddhism offer their perspectives on the Dharma and its application in modern times, especially for LGBTQI audiences. These talks are offered freely to the world and made possible by appreciative listeners. If you would like to support our efforts to share the Dharma with underserved audiences, please visit gaybuddhist.org. There you can donate, find a list of upcoming speakers, or enjoy many hundreds of these recorded talks dating back to 1996.
Thank you, Juan. Thank you, everybody. Hello, folks, near and far. I'm sorry I didn't get to come into the city today. I live in Berkeley, and it wasn't actually the weather that kept me out, although that might have been a good excuse. But I told Jeff a lot of people around me have been getting sick lately, and I have managed to avoid that, and so I'm trying to avoid it. It's difficult when so much of our mental health and spiritual health is dependent upon community and connection, to be isolated. And I was saying to my wife the other day that this reminds me of the early days of the pandemic, because in California, at least, many of us have been very isolated these days with the weather. And, I'm used to getting outside a lot, and as is she. And so I'm hanging on. It's gonna stop raining in a couple days, but I promise. They promise. I'm going to talk a bit about this book that Juan mentioned, Living Kindness. And I suspect I may have already given a talk about this to the Gay Buddhist Fellowship, because an earlier version of it was published in 2018. So that's 5 years ago. And then a couple of years ago, Shambhala, the publisher, originally I published it just straight through Amazon. And a couple of years ago, Shambhala took it on as a project. And so it's getting a lot more distribution, and they helped me to tighten it up a bit, clean up some things in it. So it's nice to have a second life. So the book is called Living Kindness, and it's anyone familiar with Buddhist teachings will recognize that that's a play on words, that a play on the Buddhist teaching called loving kindness. And it's an attempt, I guess, a kind of, can I say, reappraisal of how we approach this practice and these teachings. And it's something that comes out of, really decades of reflection on my part that eventually came out as a teaching in a book. And there's a couple of kind of core intentions behind this idea of living kindness, and behind what I wanted to talk about. The one is this idea of what we call loving kindness, and kind of how it's been presented, and I think maybe it's not even the presentation, but maybe the way it's received or perceived. And my first real questioning around this came up when I was teaching some college students to do the loving kindness meditation, and I found that they avoided the difficult parts. They just focused on the feel-good parts, and they didn't work with the part that's about the neutral people, and they didn't work especially with the part around difficult people, or what's called the enemy in some of the texts. And they also didn't do the practice of kind of radiating The practice of loving kindness is not meant to be something to just make you feel good. That's a byproduct, hopefully a byproduct. It often can make us feel good, but it's really meant to train us to be more universally loving, and to discover what unconditional love is, and then to develop insight as well into our interconnection with all beings. And this is a fundamental Buddhist principle, right? I presume you're all familiar with, at least all the people here who have been around the Buddhist world for a while, which I think most of you have. And so it's interesting to maybe think of it as, I don't know if this is like reverse engineering or backward, but to think of it, the practice as being founded in this insight into interconnection and interdependence, and the fact that we are not separate, and that it's a natural expression then of realizing, my little being, my consciousness, my body, my sense of being this separate person is really an illusion. Nothing about my life happens apart from the world. My very life is dependent on two other people coming together and creating another life. And then everything, of course, as infants and children, we're totally dependent. But even as adults, if I look around my home, I didn't build this house. I didn't build this chair. I wouldn't know how to. The first thing about building a computer or creating a program like Zoom, I'm totally dependent on the world, and this rain that we've been getting is such a great example of this. Here we've been living in California. Those of you who are in California, and it's true in many areas, under these drought conditions for years and these terrible fires, and to think that somehow, I'm separate from that. I don't have to deal with that. Is of course absurd. I have to breathe. I have to breathe, which means that I am in every moment. My dependence and interconnection with the world is keeping me alive. It's right there. So to go back then to maybe the other end of this, the very personal end of loving kindness, which is where the meditation typically begins. We're often guided to start by practicing loving kindness toward ourselves. And it's interesting that as I don't want to speak for everyone, but I think in general terms, most of us are self-centered, and not necessarily, don't even have to think of it in negative terms, but we have to take care of ourselves first. That how much we can fall into self-hatred or just self-judgment, self-criticism. Sometimes other people criticize us too. I got an email this morning from someone complaining about something they listened to a talk I gave in 2010. It's the trouble with the internet. Everything's out there forever, right? and they didn't like something I said. And so, so this morning I've been kind of walking around with this little like, oh, like I'm a bad person. I'm a bad teacher. And how we fall into this way of the self-view of negativity. And I talk about this in the book, Living Kindness. I'll actually read this little portion because I think this captures it in a way. This is it's actually chapter 1 after the introduction. And it's called May I Be Happy, Loving Yourself. I don't like myself any more than other people like themselves. I don't know. I find this amusing. Anyway, there's nobody in the world who knows better all my failings, my impatience and irritability, my prejudices and delusions, my moodiness and self-centeredness. And don't even get me started on my past. Suffice it to say, I lived the life of a self-indulgent musician for almost 20 years. Not a lot to be proud of there. Not a lot to like about myself. So the challenge of practicing loving or indeed living kindness starts with the very first step in the process, sending love to yourself. Many people find this to be an intimidating order, but I think that this difficulty results from another misunderstanding of metta. So metta is the term for loving kindness in Buddhism. You don't earn metta by being extra good or nice. You don't get metta points for being generous or selfless. Metta isn't really a part of that karmic economy. It's more of a birthright. And the simplest way, I think, to think about that in terms of ourselves is to think about other people and think, would I judge other people the way I judge myself? Or would I treat other people the way I treat myself? And, it's not to say that we're always nice to other people, but when we see someone suffering, if we have any kind of, spiritual or emotional maturity, I would say, there's just this natural response, right? And we don't have to think, oh, does this person deserve, my compassion? They're sick, or they've had a loss, or a friend, gets fired from a job, or you don't sort of think, well, I don't know if you really deserve compassion, and yet for ourselves, and again, I can't speak for everyone, and I know this isn't true of everyone, but it's a common reaction that we're kind of like, oh, I don't know, what did I do wrong? You get sick and you're like, what did I do wrong? It's like, you're sick, why is the first thing you go to a judgment, So, so what we're faced with, in this practice is to see our own internal habits, mental habits. And this is the starting point. And, this is one of the connections I think that's important to make about something like a loving kindness meditation, is that it doesn't sit separate from other Buddhist practices. It depends upon mindfulness. Because if my goal is to be loving and to practice loving kindness, the first thing I need to do is see if I'm doing that. And if I'm not doing that, have some way of responding to that. How can I respond to that? So this morning was very interesting for me, because I'm like, oh, can I give a Dharma talk on living kindness? Okay. And, and I've got this negativity in my mind and feeling it emotionally. And so, it was was my practice this morning, was like, okay, just notice that, you know, and then what I do is I try to apply, this broader awareness, like, okay, that's one person. That's a talk you gave 12 and a half years ago. And they didn't like it. And notice the language they're using in their email. It sounds like they've been watching a lot of Fox News or something. And just kind of like, okay, keep a bigger perspective. Like, and you know what? Like, there are times when I say things that aren't helpful, and there are people who aren't going to like me, and that's the risk. You put yourself out. If you want to put yourself out and do something in the world, you have to risk being criticized. Okay, can you live with that? Can you be okay with that? Yeah, I can be okay with that. And then one of my other big, go-tos is impermanence. It's like, in a few days, I'll have completely forgotten about this. This isn't important. This isn't important in my life. But again, it's so easy for us. And this is why my mindfulness is so important to, one thing, right? I think this is very common. One thing gets our attention, tends to be a negative thing. And then we just look at it and look at it, and grows and grows and grows, and it takes us over. As opposed to, oh, that's unpleasant. It's like I stubbed my toe. That hurts for a moment, but that's okay. Not, oh my God, I'm such an idiot because I walked and I stubbed my toe. What is wrong with me? I just, I'm just such a failure in life. And it reminds me of all the times I've stubbed my toe. And what about the times when I cut myself when I was chopping onions? And, it's like we turn these small things into a story, right? So this is why awareness is so important. And then there's the holding of the feeling. So let me talk a little bit about the feeling of loving kindness. The feeling of loving kindness is one of the most beautiful feelings we can have. It's the feeling of love. We don't even have to call it loving kindness, the feeling of love. So rich and, brightening it. It gives us this view of the world and a sense of wholeness and completeness. And so, if you experience that, and I hope you have experienced that, the times when I've had that experience, the strongest has been on meditation retreats. And, your mind gets pretty quiet and you're really in a peaceful place. And then you start focusing on loving kindness and cultivating that quality. And there are times when it can just sort of take you over, and you're immersed in this beautiful feeling. And it can seem that that's what loving kindness is. It's that feeling. Oh, now I know what loving kindness is. Now I've experienced it. Great. Now what I need to do is feel this, practice this all the time, and just feel this love all the time. Well, you've now fallen into a trap, because there's no feeling that you can have all the time, right? Feelings are impermanent. And when we get the idea that, oh, this is loving kindness, and then when it goes away, I don't have any loving kindness, then once again, we're in this conflict. We're in this conflict with ourselves, or how we think we should be. I should feel this. That's, the first time that I smoked marijuana when I was listening to Jimi Hendrix, I thought, I want to feel like this all the time. And I stayed high for a long time after that. But it didn't work, I didn't, I couldn't sustain that feeling. Eventually you get tired even of Jimi Hendrix, which is saying a lot. But it was just that delusion that somehow I'm going to capture something and hold on to it. When you fall in love with someone else, with another person, and you want to hold on to that, where does that lead? That you can't do it. You can't hold on to that feeling. And so the feeling of loving kindness and the feeling of love, these are beautiful things, and they're things to be enjoyed and things to be inspired by and guided by. Certainly that experience on a retreat of feeling love, universal loving kindness, is something that, as I talked about, can give me insight and make me realize I'm not separate from the world. And I may not be able to take that feeling with me, but I can take that idea with me. And I can awaken that idea each day intentionally to remind myself I am not separate. I am part of and connected with this world. I'm connected with every being and everything in this world. That's a freeing insight and a supportive insight, one that helps me to not fall into negativity, to isolation, to judgment. It helps me to awaken caring and compassion, and even to awaken the feeling of love. Just the thought of it can bring up that feeling. So we can see then that loving kindness, it depends upon mindfulness. It also is an insight practice. So again, part of the premise of this idea that I'm trying to get at in this book is that loving kindness isn't something that's separate from the rest of Buddhism or that's separate from the rest of Buddhist meditation. It's interconnected with it. It depends upon mindfulness. It supports insight. So when we start to see this, that we don't have to feel all gushy and lovey all the time to be a person inspired by loving kindness, then this idea, this term, living kindness, starts to resonate. I think it starts to make sense, because you see, no matter how I'm feeling, what I'm thinking, I can still be living kindness. So interesting. One of the influences on my work is a great scholar monk, Venerable Analio. And in one of his books, he talks about following the precepts to not kill, not steal, not harm sexually, not harm verbally, not lie, not use intoxicants to the point of heedlessness. There are these simple guidelines for living that the Buddha put out. And again, these are seen as kind of one part of the path, right? Oftentimes, or kind of presented as, you should do this, but maybe not shown as being interconnected with the rest of the path. But in fact, Analio points out that when we live by these principles, which are principles of non-harming, we are acting out of compassion, that it is a compassionate act to not kill, steal, or harm people in any way. And I try to follow the precepts. I'm not perfect in that regard, but I do try to follow them. And I would typically, without this idea from Analio, I would typically think, oh, that's like, I don't get any particular benefit from that. I mean, yes, I get some worldly benefit or whatever, maybe karmic benefit, but it's not really helping anybody that I'm doing this. But then you realize, oh yeah, there's a lot of people, like, it's not so much that I'm not doing this, it's recognizing that when you do these things, when you kill and steal and harm people sexually and lie, that you do tremendous damage to the world. And in fact, the suffering of the world is largely based on people doing these things and breaking these precepts. So that, when I was first introduced to the precepts, I thought of them as kind of the kindergarten version of Buddhism. Like the real Buddhism is meditating for hours and hours and, getting enlightened. Oh, those precepts, oh, that's just for kids. Well, no, they're the things that will change the world. And so it's an act of compassion. If you are living by the precepts, you are living kindness. You are practicing loving kindness and compassion in your daily life, just as a kind of baseline. And that makes me feel good. I feel good about that. And it makes me really appreciate that aspect, what's called sila aspect of Buddhism, the ethics and morality. And, I in my later years now, in my later years of being a Buddhist and being a human, because my bio there is a little older. I've been practicing for over 40 years now. The people that really inspire me are the monks and nuns, and they're the ones, when I listen to a Dharma talk, when I read, those are the people that I study. And it's interesting. And these are the ones who you think, well, they're the ones who are really enlightened and really advanced, and they're probably going to teach about emptiness and enlightenment. A lot of what I hear from them is about the precepts and about sila and living out of kindness, not hating, non-hatred, non-judgment. So I take that as being a good set of guidelines to live out of kindness. So there's this term that shows up in the Buddhist suttas, and I will say that besides my wish to sort of expand people's understanding of loving kindness, the other goal in this book was to bring out some of the richness of the Buddhist suttas, these early teachings. And so when the Buddha talks about loving kindness in those suttas, he often, instead of saying loving kindness or metta, he often says non-ill will or non-hatred as a substitute for loving kindness. And I find that, I admit that for many years I read those suttas and my eye just kind of ran over those words. And I was just like, okay, he's just talking about loving kindness. But there are a couple of things that are worth looking more carefully at in his use of that term, non-ill will. And the first is to just compare it to the word love. If someone says to you, you should love everyone, that has a certain idea, and it's a challenge, and it's a beautiful challenge. It's very inspiring, but it's also sort of, in some ways, it can feel unreachable, or at least certainly at some moments it can seem unreachable. But the idea of non-ill will is don't hate anyone. And that, for me, in a way, kind of narrows it down. Now you're not thinking about everybody. You're just thinking about the people that you are inclined to feel negatively about. And you're not being asked to embrace them necessarily, but rather see if you can just let go of the negativity. And maybe in some of the commentarial teachings, it suggests just try to turn them into a neutral person, or to have neutral feelings about them. It's like, yeah, I'm not loving you, but I'm not going to hate you. So I like that. Again, just as it's like a subtle shift in thinking and perspective. Oh, all right, and it's kind of like, instead of this idea of loving everybody where it's sort of like this thing has to flow out of me, instead it's like, it's more like having a boundary. Like, okay, I'm just going to restrain and refrain from letting that negativity go out of me, and I'm just going to stay within myself. A little different in that regard. And what appeals to me about it as well is how it connects to the larger Buddhist sort of agenda, which is letting go. You know, when we look at the Four Noble Truths that are about what causes suffering and what ends suffering, it's essentially that what causes suffering is clinging, and what ends suffering is letting go. So, you know, we're all familiar with this idea in Buddhism of letting go. When we sit down to meditate, we try to let go of our thoughts and our obsessions and, all the stuff that's going on in the mind. But again, so we see that the Buddha, instead of telling us all the time what to do, a lot of what he's saying is telling us what not to do. And this, again, is kind of a real shift. And it makes sense, because as he shows us in the Four Noble Truths, we realize that every time we're striving for something, it's starting from a point, from the sense that I'm lacking something. So even with loving kindness, it can be like, oh, I'm lacking love. I need to cultivate more love. And that feeling itself, just that starting point, is dukkha, is suffering, is unsatisfactoriness by definition. I need this thing, I need this person, I need this job, I need this house, whatever it is, and by I need something means that I'm lacking something. So, our impulse, our way of thinking, our ordinary way of thinking is, oh, the way to be happy is to get the things that I want, and then I'll be okay. But in an actuality, the way that plays out is that we just stay in this cycle of wanting. So we're wanting things, we get some things, and then we want more things. We want pleasure, we get some pleasure, we want some more pleasure. So we're actually, by pursuing and grasping onto things, we're conditioning ourselves to want more, habituating ourselves to want more. So the Buddhist principle is that if we let go and let go and let go, that we are conditioning ourselves to want less. And when we want nothing, we are, by definition, satisfied, right? That's satisfaction. Well, again, our culture and our conditioning tells us that we have to get things to be satisfied. But the Buddha, his brilliance is that he saw that did not work. That, in fact, if we could learn to not want anything, that then we would finally be completely satisfied. And so in the same way, if we cannot hate anything, we are completely loving. That's we have fulfilled the loving principle. If you're out there trying to love everything, you have to find everything first. Where is everything? Is there anything hiding there that I'm not loving? Is there anybody out there I don't love? You know, but if it's just, oh, I'm just not going to hate anything, but you drop hate, what's there? Love. That joy and that fullness. So I think that's a good spot for me to wrap up. So I'll just say thank you for your attention, and I hope these words have been of some benefit. And we have some time, so if people want to chime in with any questions or observations, be happy to hear them.
Great. Thank you, Kevin. We really appreciate your talk. And I'll just mention before we start with the questions is that if anyone asks questions in the room, I'm just going to repeat them because last session we had like some issues with the microphone, so I'm not going to move it this time.
Okay.
With that
But you'll
said,
repeat the questions in the room. That'd be great. Thank you.
Oh, there's one hand up. Yeah, Tom, go for it.
Kevin, this is Tom. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
You know, you arrived at a really profound place at the end of your talk that I wasn't expecting. And that idea that, you know, rather than trying to cultivate loving kindness, which is a form of grasping, it's more the opposite of just a falling away of whatever blocks it. Yeah. You know, I've heard it said that the opposite of love is fear, you know, as opposed to hate, but, you know, it's probably both. Can you maybe speak a little bit about that? How our fears perhaps stand in the way of loving kindness?
That's great. Thank you, Tom. That's one of my chapters. Because just like you, you know, you're thinking, at least I was thinking of the book title, which is probably 40 years old. Love is letting go of fear. I don't know if you remember that one, but yeah, I think it's really interesting to investigate how anger arises, and that so fear comes out of a perceived threat. And so our response to a perceived threat, you know, is, you know, fight or flight, basically. And so this makes a direct connection between fear and anger. You know, I tell a little story about, you know, a bad, like a road rage incident. And I was I was cut off. This is like, you know, 40 years ago on a freeway in LA, and I was cut off, and I got enraged and went chasing after the person, you know, which, you know, is, we know, very unwise. But looking back on it, it's clear to me that the fear triggered this anger, and I mean, maybe it goes both ways, but it's what's, I think, incumbent upon us is when we are starting to feel anger. I mean, I think the point of this is when the anger is showing up, is to bring some attention to that and reflection on the cause, and see that it's because we feel threatened that we're feeling this anger. And that when we see that for ourselves, it's then, I think, possible to arouse compassion for ourselves, because this is where we want to get to, right? When we're dealing with particularly these difficult feelings, if we can have compassion for ourselves rather than either judgment or reactivity, then it shifts the whole emotional experience and the whole expression, the mental experience of it too. So when I see, oh, you know, I feel threatened, and a lot of the times, what our fear is really ego fear, right? That oh, somebody like, okay, like I get this email this morning, right? And it's a threat, right, to my ego because someone is criticizing me, and it's like, oh, that's painful. And this goes back to something I was saying earlier, to be able to see my own pain with compassion rather than with judgment. Rather than saying, I shouldn't feel that, or, why I shouldn't be angry, or else blaming, oh, it's their fault that I'm feeling this, and falling into that story. I can turn back on myself and see, oh, that vulnerable part of myself feels threatened, and that's difficult. And so to breathe with that and bring up an attitude of kindness and compassion toward myself. But it really requires, the thing that's hard about it is that these are very primal emotions, fear and anger. And, they're operating there very rapidly, right? So in the brain process, just reading about the brain stem and the lizard brain and the mammalian brain, it's like fear and anger come out of that lizard brain, like that, and that stuff comes up much faster than our prefrontal cortex can process it. So it's very difficult to be mindful in those moments. This is one of the reasons why we have to really train ourselves to be mindful much more habitually, so that it's not like something we think of the next day, like, oh, I shouldn't have acted like that we can catch it. So we're training ourselves to intervene in those reactive patterns and be able to stop and bring mindfulness in. Once there is mindfulness, we have the capacity to transform the experience, right? We can see it. Oh, right, I see where I'm coming from. Okay, I'm okay. Like, I don't have to fall into this. Now, what would be a wise way? And then we can reflect carefully, like, what would be a wise way to respond here? Oh, well, I'm not going to write an email immediately back to this guy telling him he's a complete asshole and get off my, lose my email. I'm going to, I actually, what happened this morning, I mean, to go off, but I thought, oh, I wonder what I said. So I started searching for the talk. So I want to listen to the talk. Maybe I said something really stupid. Sometimes I do, or maybe, maybe this person is really off base. Okay, if they're really off base, I'm just going to leave them alone because you don't respond. But maybe there's something in there that I could learn from, and of course, that then becomes much more valuable than being reactive, right? It's like, oh, there's fear and there's all these feelings, but can I put them aside? And is there something I can benefit from this situation? So I hope that's helpful. I know that's not capturing all of this issue.
It is, but fair warning, Kevin, you've now given 11 talks at GBF, and we're about to publish all of those as a podcast, so they'll go out to the world.
Oh, no. So many ways I failed. There's a great saying from, it's in Suzuki Roshi's book, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. He says, a Zen master's life is one continuous mistake. Shoshaku, Jushaku. And so I always take a lot of comfort in that. One continuous mistake. I see a hand. Did I see a hand?
Yeah, there are a couple. Yeah, Jeff has a question in the room.
Yeah.
Just a comment. I really appreciate your sort of unfolding that notion about loving kindness and starting from a deficit. But that really what we're trying to do is not generate something necessarily or add anything, but maybe or subtract anything, but the absence of neutrality, as you put it. So I really like that. I appreciate that. It made it very clear. Thank you.
So did you get that, Kevin? Oh yeah, you did get it.
that he appreciates the not adding something and not necessarily subtracting something, but sort of the absence of, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. I think Steve had a question too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you, Kevin, for the talk. It really was enlightening for me in that I was taking all these notes. It's sort of like reframing from going from loving kindness to living kindness is really a very helpful reframing for me. This idea of non-ill will, like say we don't have to embrace everyone, we don't have to love everyone, but we could have a neutral stance and not let things out of our control, rile us and make us angry or fearful. And so I just really appreciate your perspective, and I really learned a lot. So I appreciate
Wonderful.
your talk.
Thank you. So I will, I think Shambhala will appreciate if I put a link to the page on the Shambhala website where you can purchase the book. And for about 12 more days until January 27th, you can get a 30% discount with using the code LK30. So there you go. That's your advertising for the morning. No, and I don't want you to be grasping after my book, though. It's just buying it with, I don't know how you buy something without grasping. Good luck.
And Kevin, I had a question actually. I just wanted to echo like that. I love the talk today, and I really like the fact that you pointed to a part of the precepts that I never had paid attention before, which is the fact that they're not affirmative, they're negative, right? Like they're just like do no harm. Don't harm others with your sexuality and intoxicants and all of that. And I confess that sometimes I guess I struggle with two things. Sometimes I say too much, but sometimes I say too little, or I do too much, or I do too little. And I'm wondering why the emphasis of the precepts is on the negative side.
Yeah, well, I will say there are also positive versions of all the precepts. So loving kindness is a positive version of the precept to not kill. Generosity is a positive version of the precept to not steal. Honesty is the positive version of not lying, and etc. So that's there. But I think it just, it's first of all just a way. I mean, these guidelines, which we find in most religions, I think maybe all religions, are first just ways for human beings to live together. And, if people do these acts of harm, it causes so much turmoil in society that, humans figured out a long time ago that they needed to have these rules because many of these precepts also are laws, so they're really, they start as a social contract. In the spiritual realm, though, what Bhikkhu Bodhi, who's another of the great Buddhist scholars, says that following the precepts is about spiritual purification or mental purification. That is, when we act in these ways, in these destructive ways, it creates mental reactions to it. If you are violent, greedy, harming people, stealing, your inner life is in turmoil as well. You know, we know that there's a moral wound that happens when people kill. This is one of the reasons why so many soldiers suffer from PTSD. It's, to put them in a position where they're forced to kill and do violence. They come home, and even though what they were doing was in the service of some, some purpose of the nation, and there's nothing criminal about it, they nonetheless have experienced this moral wound that then creates this tremendous turmoil and suffering in their minds. So, I mean, that's just one example, and it's a tragic example. But the precepts in terms of a spiritual framework are meant to help us to have inner peace, to be, so that when we sit down to meditate, we aren't besieged by guilt and shame and regret and all that goes along with that.
Thank you.
And as I say, then once we have that baseline, then we start to act in positive ways, and then generosity and kindness come forward, and those. But the Buddhist, one of the kind of understanding, a principle of Buddhism, is that when you let go of the negative aspects of the mind and of behavior, what arises naturally is this goodness, the Buddha nature, if you will, loving kindness and generosity, that these are natural human qualities that are kind of covered over by these more negative instinctual grasping elements.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Greg. Thank you very much for your talk. There was so much in it. I've been reading before I go to bed every night, just a 1 or 2 page Temple Chodron sort of mini teaching, and she has one, as I often do. I read them 2 or 3 or 4 nights in a row, so they really sink in. And the one I've been reading recently, I think, is about loving kindness, but also impermanent, also connection. So this is a comment, not a question so far. But it says when you see someone else suffering, reach out to them mentally and say, no. It says when you yourself, see, I need to read it some more. When you yourself feel suffering, remember that is a human condition, that everybody feels suffering. And when you feel joy, remember that everybody at some point feels a joy. And that's a way of loving kindness, but I've been in myself a lot lately, and it's just such a good way to remember and interconnectedness and be interconnected. And it really, my partner says, the way to get out of depression is to do something for somebody else. Mm-hmm. And it just takes me out of my, judging and negative thinking, and so I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, one of the afflictions of humans is thinking that we are unique. And so when we experience something difficult, we think that there's something uniquely wrong with us or uniquely painful for us. And to realize our shared humanity is definitely freeing. And the last comment about service and helping others as an antidote to depression, I remember reading that in Daniel Goleman's book, Emotional Intelligence. And it's, in the 12-step world that I come out of, that's also a basic principle too, that, you do service to take your mind off yourself. So yeah, thank you. Very nice.